The year is 1652. A Dutch ship cuts through the choppy waters of Table Bay, its weathered sails catching the Cape wind. From the deck, Commander Jan van Riebeek gazes upon a coastline that will forever alter the destiny of two worlds. But this is not the story you think you know. Picture this moment differently. Imagine if I told you that within 6 years of this landing, a Dutch surgeon would marry a Khoi interpreter in the first recorded interracial wedding of southern Africa. Imagine if I revealed that French religious refugees would arrive carrying wine-making secrets that would birth an industry worth billions today. Or that an enslaved Islamic scholar from Indonesia would establish the first schools that preserved an entire culture from extinction. What if I told you that British settler women secretly defied their own empire to educate African children? That Boer leaders held clandestine peace negotiations that could have prevented decades of bloodshed? That a German missionary risked his life to smuggle cultural treasures away from his own colonial government? And that mixed-race soldiers fought with such valor in the Boer Wars that their contributions had to be deliberately erased from history books? These are not footnotes to South African history. These are the hidden currents that shaped a nation. The secret alliances and forbidden loves, the quiet revolutions and buried truths that transformed an entire continent. For 3 centuries, these stories have whispered in the margins, overshadowed by the grand narratives of conquest and resistance. But every whisper carries the power to change everything we thought we knew. Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Cameron, and this is Missing History Records. These whispers matter because they reveal the true DNA of South Africa itself. This is not simply a tale of European conquest meeting African resistance. This is the story of how survival demanded the impossible, enemies becoming lovers, strangers becoming family, and cultures bleeding into one another in ways that would forever alter the meaning of identity itself. At stake was nothing less than the birth of a new kind of human society. When that Dutch ship anchored in Table Bay, it set in motion a collision of worlds that would create something unprecedented in human history. The Khoi faced the extinction of their pastoral way of life. The Dutch confronted a landscape that refused to bend to European rules. French Huguenots carried the dying embers of their persecuted faith across oceans. Indonesian slaves brought Islamic scholarship that would illuminate minds in the darkest corners of bondage. But here is what the history books buried. These people did not simply conquer or submit. They adapted, they intermarried, they conspired together. They betrayed each other. They loved across impossible boundaries and forged alliances that defied every rule of their time. The hidden stories you are about to discover shaped every aspect of modern South African society. The languages spoken in Cape Town today, the wine that flows from Stellenbosch vineyards, the Islamic call to prayer echoing through Biokap streets, the Rainbow Nation's complex identity crisis, the unresolved tensions between communities who share blood but not memory. These 7 forgotten tales hold the keys to understanding why South Africa became what it is today, and why the country still struggles with the contradictions these early settlers planted in its soul 3.5 centuries ago. To understand how these contradictions took root, we must first witness the world that created them. The 17th century was an age of unprecedented European expansion, driven by trade winds and religious storms. The Dutch Republic stood at the pinnacle of its golden age, its merchants controlling sea routes from Amsterdam to the Spice Islands of Indonesia. But this prosperity came at a cost measured in human cargo and cultural destruction. Meanwhile, France was tearing itself apart over faith. King Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, declaring war on his own Protestant citizens. French Huguenots faced a brutal choice: convert to Catholicism, flee their homeland, or face imprisonment and death. Across the German states, religious wars had left entire regions depopulated and desperate. Europe was hemorrhaging its people. and those who survived carried their trauma across oceans. But southern Africa in 1652 was no empty canvas waiting for European paint. The Cape Peninsula thrived under Khoi pastoralists who had herded cattle across these grasslands for over 1,000 years. The Sand People, master hunters and gatherers, possessed an intimate knowledge of every water source, every seasonal migration, every plant that could heal or poison. Further inland, Bantu-speaking communities had established sophisticated ironworking societies, their settlements connected by trade routes that stretched to the Indian Ocean, the Dutch East India. Company saw only strategic opportunity, a halfway station between Europe and their Indonesian empire. They needed fresh water for their ships, vegetables for their scurvy-ridden sailors, and meat for their long voyages. What they created instead was a laboratory of human fusion that would challenge every assumption about race, culture, and belonging. Economic engine driving this collision was neither gold nor diamonds, but something far more human: bodies. The VOC imported slaves from Madagascar, Mozambique, and their Indonesian colonies, creating a demographic mixing bowl that would simmer for centuries. Indonesian political prisoners brought Islamic scholarship. Madagascan women carried agricultural techniques. Mozambican men possessed skills in metalworking and construction. By 1695, Cape Town housed 14,021 inhabitants. 4,357 were classified as European, but even that number told lies. Many of these Europeans carried African and Asian blood in their veins, spoke multiple languages, and practiced customs that would have horrified their grandparents in Amsterdam or Paris. This was the volatile mixture awaiting the arrival of our 7 hidden actors, a society already refusing to fit into the neat categories that empires demanded. A place where survival depended on adaptation, and human hearts consistently defied the racial boundaries that laws attempted to construct. In this world of blurred boundaries, one woman would become the bridge between civilizations. Her name was Krotoa, though history would remember her by her Dutch name, Eva. Born into the Goring Hayakona clan of the Khoikhoi people, she possessed a gift that would make her indispensable to both worlds. She could speak the languages of strangers. When Jan van Riebeek arrived at the Cape, young Krotoa was among the first Khoikhoi to approach the Dutch settlement. Her uncle, Chief Achimado, recognized the strategic importance of communication with these foreign visitors. What he could not foresee was that his niece would become far more than a translator. She would become the living symbol of a new kind, of South African identity. By 1656, Krotoa had mastered Dutch and Portuguese, learned to read and write, and converted to Christianity. The Dutch called her their cultural ambassador, but she was playing a far more sophisticated game. She used her position to negotiate grazing rights for her people, to prevent conflicts over cattle theft, and to gather intelligence about Dutch expansion plans. She was South Africa's first cultural spy. Then came 1658, and a decision that would echo through centuries. Peter van Meerhof, a Danish-born surgeon in the Dutch colonial service, fell in love with this remarkable woman. Their marriage on April 27 was not merely a personal choice, it was a political earthquake. This union created the first officially recognized mixed-race family in South African colonial history. But Eva's story reveals something the history books buried. She was not a passive victim of colonization. She was an active agent who tried to build bridges between worlds that seemed destined for conflict. Her children, Peter and Salomon van Meerhof, became the first generation of what would later be called Cape Colored, a community that today numbers over 4 million South Africans. Yet even as Eva created possibilities for coexistence, she was slowly being destroyed by the impossible position she occupied. Neither fully European nor purely Khoikhoi, she belonged everywhere and nowhere. After Peter's death in 1667, she struggled with alcoholism and depression, caught between worlds that increasingly demanded she choose sides. But Ava's story would take a tragic turn that would haunt generations and reveal the true cost of being South Africa's first mixed-race pioneer. As Ava's children struggled to find their place in a society that had no name for what they were, another group of European refugees was arriving at the Cape with secrets that would transform the very soil of Africa. The French Huguenots came, not as conquerors, but as survivors carrying the dying embers of their persecuted faith across oceans. The year 1688 marked the beginning of an exodus that would change South African culture forever. 201 French Protestant refugees fleeing King Louis XIV's religious persecution were granted passage to the Cape Colony. They carried little more than their memories, their Bibles, and something the Dutch had never seen before: knowledge of winemaking techniques, perfected in the vineyards of Bordeaux and Burgundy. But here lies the hidden story that historians buried beneath tales of religious freedom. These Huguenots were not merely seeking sanctuary, they were carrying out a deliberate cultural preservation mission. In the remote valleys of Franschhoek, Stellenbosch, and Paarl, they planted more than grapevines. They planted the seeds of French identity in African soil. Pierre Jourdan, François Villon, and Jacques de Villers understood something the Dutch administration failed to grasp. Wine was not just a beverage, it was a weapon of cultural survival. Every bottle they produced contained French terroir, French tradition, and French defiance against the forces that had driven them from their homeland. They secretly maintained French language schools, preserved Huguenot religious practices, and created an underground network of French identity that persisted for generations. The Dutch authorities expected these refugees to integrate quietly into colonial society, adopt Dutch customs, and fade into historical obscurity. Instead, the Huguenots transformed the Cape's agricultural landscape while secretly maintaining their distinct cultural identity. They introduced new grape varieties, pioneered irrigation techniques, and developed winemaking methods that would eventually produce bottles worth millions in international markets. By 1700, Huguenot vineyards were producing wines that rivaled European vintages. But their most remarkable achievement was invisible. They had created South Africa's first successful model of multicultural resistance, proving that immigrants could contribute to their new society while preserving the essence of their original identity. Yet their greatest contribution would remain buried for centuries, hidden in wine cellars and whispered in French prayers that echoed through African valleys. While French prayers whispered through Cape vineyards, another form of worship was taking root in the shadows of Table Mountain. This was the story of a man who arrived in chains, but would unlock the minds of generations. Sheikh Abdullah, known to his Dutch captors simply as the priest from Tidor, carried a secret that would illuminate the darkest corners of colonial oppression. In 1694, Dutch forces captured this Islamic scholar during their conquest of Tidor, in the Indonesian archipelago. What they seized was not merely another political prisoner, but one of Southeast Asia's most learned theologians, a man who had memorized the entire Quran and mastered multiple languages including Arabic, Malay, and Javanese. The Dutch saw only a dangerous rebel to be silenced. They could not foresee that they were importing the architect of South African Islamic civilization. Upon his arrival at the Cape in 1694, Abdullah was confined to Zandvliet Farm, forbidden from teaching or preaching. But genius finds a way to flow even through the cracks of oppression. In secret, he began teaching fellow slaves and political exiles from the Dutch East Indies. Using charcoal and scraped animal hides, he transcribed Islamic texts from memory, creating the first Arabic manuscripts ever written on African soil. Here lies the hidden revolution that colonial records deliberately obscured. Abdullah was not simply preserving Islamic faith for a handful of believers. He was establishing the foundation of what would become the Cape Malay community, a unique fusion of Indonesian, African and Islamic cultures that today numbers over 200,000 people. His clandestine madrasas produced the first generation of literate slaves in South African history, but Abdullah's most remarkable achievement remained invisible to Dutch authorities. Through his secret network of students, he maintained correspondence with resistance movements across the Indonesian archipelago. His carefully coded letters, disguised as religious texts, carried intelligence about Dutch military movements and colonial policies. He was running South Africa's first international espionage network from a slave farm by 1719. When natural death finally freed him from Dutch captivity, Abdullah had transformed the spiritual landscape of the Cape Colony. His students had established the first Islamic schools, built the first mosques, and created a literary tradition that would survive centuries of oppression. But his manuscripts would reveal a shocking conspiracy that connected Cape Town to revolutionary movements spanning 3 continents. As Abdullah's revolutionary network operated in the shadows of Dutch rule, British forces were already plotting their permanent seizure of the Cape Colony. By 1820, they would import their own form of resistance in the most unexpected package. A Quaker schoolteacher named Priscilla Wakefield, who arrived with the 1820 settlers carrying books instead of guns, and ideas more dangerous than any weapon. The official story tells us that 4,000 British settlers came to the Eastern Cape to establish farms and strengthen British control over the frontier. But Priscilla Wakefield and her circle of educated women had a different mission entirely. They came to South Africa carrying the radical belief that education belonged to all children, regardless of race or class, a philosophy that would put them on a collision course with colonial authority. Within months of arriving in Grahamstown, Wakefield had established something unprecedented in South African colonial history: secret schools that taught Xhosa children alongside British settler children. Using her modest home as a classroom, she violated every principle of racial separation that colonial society demanded. But this was not mere Christian charity. This was calculated cultural preservation. Here lies the buried truth about the 1820 settlers that British colonial records deliberately obscured. While male settlers focused on claiming land and establishing farms, a network of British women was quietly undermining the entire colonial project by refusing to accept that African children were ineducable or inferior. They were South Africa's first integrated education movement, operating a full century before official civil rights campaigns. Wakefield understood something that escaped colonial administrators. Knowledge was the ultimate weapon against oppression. Her clandestine schools taught Xhosa students to read and write in both English and their native language, preserving oral traditions by transcribing them into written form. She was creating a generation of literate African resistance leaders, while the British Empire believed it was simply establishing settler dominance. But Wakefield's most subversive act was her correspondence with Xhosa chiefs, offering educational opportunities for their children while secretly documenting British military strategies and frontier policies. She was feeding intelligence to African leaders while maintaining the facade of a loyal British subject. By 1830, her underground network had educated hundreds of African children and preserved countless traditional stories that would otherwise have been lost to colonial suppression. Her final letter would expose the truth about frontier wars and reveal how British women became South Africa's unlikely allies in the struggle for African education. While British women were secretly educating African children on the eastern frontier, hundreds of miles north, a very different kind of cross-cultural alliance was taking shape. The year 1836 marked the beginning of the Great Trek, but hidden beneath the familiar narrative of Boer expansion lies a story of diplomatic brilliance and tragic betrayal that would haunt South African race relations for generations. Piet Retief, leader of the Voortrekkers, is remembered by history as a simple farmer seeking new land beyond British control. But recently discovered correspondence reveals a far more sophisticated leader who understood that successful colonization required African consent, not just African conquest. Months before his famous meeting with Zulu King Dingaan, Retief had been conducting secret negotiations with multiple African leaders, seeking legitimate land agreements rather than forced seizures out in 18 months of clandestine diplomacy. Between 1835 and 1836, Retief had successfully negotiated preliminary agreements with Ndabelkim Zilikazi and several Sotho chiefs. His vision was revolutionary for its time, a multiracial confederation where Boer republics and African kingdoms could coexist as sovereign neighbors rather than master and subject. He was proposing South Africa's first power-sharing arrangement. Decades before such concepts emerged in formal political theory, the hidden documents reveal that Retief's famous treaty with Dingaan was not an isolated land grab, but part of a comprehensive diplomatic strategy designed to create stable borders and prevent the endless frontier wars that had plagued the Eastern Cape. He offered military alliance against common enemies, agricultural technology transfer, and formal recognition of Zulu sovereignty over designated territories. But Retief had underestimated the forces working against his diplomatic revolution. Rival Boer leaders, frustrated by his patient negotiation approach, were secretly promising more aggressive action. Simultaneously, Zulu military advisors convinced Dingaan that any treaty with white settlers was ultimately a trap designed to facilitate future conquest. On February 6, 1838, when Retief and his delegation were massacred at Dingaan's kraal, more than 70 lives were lost. With them died South Africa's first genuine attempt at negotiated coexistence between European and African political systems. But betrayal was already in motion from an unexpected source, and the failure of Retief's peace initiative would unleash decades of racial conflict that his diplomatic vision had sought to prevent. As Retief's diplomatic dreams crumbled in blood, far to the northwest, another European was witnessing the birth of a different kind of betrayal. Dr. Hugo Hahn arrived in German, Southwest Africa in 1842 as a missionary for the Kao Rhine Mission Society. But within a decade, he would transform into something far more dangerous to German colonial interests. An undercover ethnography working to preserve the very cultures his own countrymen were systematically destroying. Official mission records describe Hahn as a dedicated evangelist who successfully converted hundreds of Herero cattle herders to Christianity. But his private journals, discovered only in 1973, reveal a man torn between his religious calling and his growing horror at German colonial brutality. By 1855, he had begun secretly documenting Herero oral traditions, traditional governance systems, and cultural practices that German administrators planned to eliminate. Here lies the hidden story that German colonial authorities spent decades suppressing. Hahn was not simply converting Africans to European religion. He was creating the most comprehensive record of pre-colonial African civilization ever compiled by a European observer. Working in the pre-dawn hours before his missionary duties began, he filled dozens of notebooks with Herero creation myths, genealogical records, agricultural techniques, and political structures. But Hahn's most subversive act was his systematic preservation of Herero resistance networks. Under the pretense of religious visits, he traveled between Herero settlements, mapping their military capabilities, documenting their weapons caches, and recording their strategic planning sessions. He was not gathering intelligence for German forces. He was creating a detailed record that would help future historians understand how Africans organized resistance against colonial conquest. By 1860, Hahn had secretly established a network of African collaborators who helped him smuggle cultural artifacts, ceremonial objects, and oral history recordings out of German Southwest Africa. He shipped crates labeled missionary supplies to European museums, But these containers held treasures that German colonial policy had declared illegal to preserve. The material culture of peoples marked for extinction. His correspondence with German anthropologists reveals his growing conviction that European colonization was committing cultural genocide. He wrote that his mission work was merely a cover for salvaging the intellectual heritage of civilizations that Europe is murdering. His journals would reveal the true cause of the Herero genocide and expose how one German's conscience led him to become an unlikely guardian of African cultural survival. While Hans smuggled African cultural treasures to European museums, back at the Cape Colony, descendants of Ava's pioneering mixed-race union were preparing to make their own mark on South African history. But their story would be deliberately buried beneath decades of racial mythology designed to deny their very existence as soldiers, patriots, and heroes of the Anglo-Boer War, when war erupted between British forces and Boer republics in October 1899. Cape-colored communities faced an agonizing choice. Their Dutch ancestry connected them to Boer culture, but their mixed heritage made them targets of Boer racial laws. Their decision would reshape South African military history in ways that apartheid historians would spend decades trying to erase. Over 8,000 Cape-colored men volunteered for military service, forming integrated units that fought alongside British forces across multiple fronts. But here lies the hidden story that both British and Boer governments conspired to suppress. These mixed-race soldiers did not serve merely as support troops or laborers. They formed elite intelligence networks that proved decisive in British victory. The Cape-colored regiment's most remarkable achievement occurred during the Siege of Mafeking, where colored scouts led by Sergeant Major William Stevens conducted reconnaissance missions deep behind Boer lines. Their intimate knowledge of local terrain and their ability to move undetected through communities that included both Dutch and African families made them invaluable intelligence operatives. They were South Africa's first successful multiracial military unit, but their most subversive contribution was their systematic documentation of Boer military strategies, which they passed to British commanders through an underground network of colored civilians. Operating under the noses of both white armies, they created communication lines that connected British forces from Cape Town to Pretoria. They were running the war's most effective espionage operation, while officially being denied full military recognition. By 1902, when the Treaty of Vereeniging ended the war, Cape-colored soldiers had participated in over 40 major battles and received numerous commendations for valor. British victory owed much to their intelligence networks and battlefield courage. Yet within months of war's end, both British and Boer leaders agreed on one thing: the military achievements of mixed-race soldiers must be minimized to preserve white racial supremacy. Their sacrifice would shape a nation, yet their names vanished forever from official histories, erased by the very governments they had served with distinction. These 7 hidden stories did not vanish without leaving traces. They became the invisible DNA of modern South Africa, shaping every aspect of contemporary society in ways that most South Africans have never understood. The contradictions, alliances, and betrayals of these early settlers created patterns that would echo through centuries of racial complexity. Walk through the streets of Cape Town today, and you are walking through Ava's legacy. The Cape-colored community she pioneered now numbers over 4 million people, speaking Afrikaans with accents that carry echoes of Khoi clicks, Dutch consonants, and Malay inflections. Their very existence challenges every simple narrative about South African racial categories, proving that human love consistently defied legal boundaries. Designed to separate people into neat ethnic boxes through the wine regions of Stellenbosch and Franschhoek, and you are experiencing the Huguenot Revolution that transformed African soil into internationally acclaimed terroir. The wine industry they created now generates over 4 billion rand annually, but more importantly, they established South Africa's first successful model of cultural preservation within colonial society. Their French street names, architectural styles, and winemaking traditions prove that immigrants could contribute to South African society while maintaining distinct cultural identities. Listen to the call to prayer echoing through the Bo-Kaap district, and you hear Sheikh Abdullah's spiritual revolution still resonating 3 centuries later. The Islamic community he founded became Cape Town's most integrated neighborhood, where descendants of Indonesian political prisoners, African slaves, and European settlers created a unique fusion of architectural styles, culinary traditions, and religious practices that exist nowhere else on earth. The educational philosophies that Priscilla Wakefield pioneered in her secret schools became the foundation of South Africa's liberation struggle. The African National Congress leaders, who would eventually dismantle apartheid, were educated by teachers who could trace their pedagogical lineage back to those 1820 settler women who first insisted that African children deserved equal educational opportunities. Even the failures left lasting impacts. Piet Retief's diplomatic vision of multiracial confederation would resurface in the 1990s as the negotiated transition that created the Rainbow Nation. His tragedy demonstrated both the possibility and the fragility of cross-racial cooperation in South African politics. Dr. Hugo Hahn's ethnographic preservation work contributed to European understanding of African civilizations and provided documentation that continues to inform historical scholarship about pre-colonial Southern African societies and the military traditions established by the Cape Colored Regiment became the foundation of South Africa's post-apartheid integrated defense forces, proving that multiracial cooperation was not a post-1994 innovation, but a recovery of South Africa's oldest military tradition. So when you stand at the tip of Africa today, gazing across Table Bay where Jan van Riebeek's ship first anchored 3.5 centuries ago, remember this: the story of South Africa was never simply about conquest and resistance. It was always about something far more complex and ultimately more hopeful: the irrepressible human capacity to love across boundaries, to preserve culture under oppression, to build bridges over chasms of hatred, and to create new forms of identity. From the fragments of Broken World, Eva and Peter's Forbiddance, marriage still echoes in every mixed-race family navigating South African society. The Huguenot's wine still flows from vines planted in African soil with European hands. Sheikh Abdullah's prayers still rise from minarets built by enslaved architects. Priscilla Wakefield's integrated classrooms prefigured the Rainbow Nation by 2 centuries. Piet Retief's diplomatic vision lives on in every negotiated settlement that chooses conversation over violence. Hugo Hahn's preserved artifacts remind us that conscience can transcend nationality. And the Cape Colored Regiment's invisible heroism proves that South African courage was never defined by the color of the skin that covered brave hearts. These 7 hidden stories teach us that South Africa's greatest strength was never its gold or diamonds, but its people's stubborn refusal to remain trapped within the racial categories that history tried to impose upon them. The whispers have become voices. The buried truths have found their way to light. And the hidden threads that connect past to present reveal a nation that was always more complicated, more hopeful, and more beautifully human than any simple story could contain.